Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today it's book review time again, and I'm going to take a look at The Hunger of the Gods by John Gwynne. And I initially forgot to say this, so I'm just going to slot in an extra little bit of video here. But this is, of course, going to be a spoiler-free review for The Hunger of the Gods. Just by talking about some of the elements, there may be mild spoilers for The Shadow of the Gods as book one, but generally speaking, I don't delve into specific plot points, so there shouldn't be too much of that. I would recommend, though, maybe skipping on this review for the moment if you haven't yet read The Shadow of the Gods. So The Hunger of the Gods was always going to be one of, if not my most anticipated book of 2022. I'm a big John Gwynne fan. I've been following his work and enjoying his writing for nearly 10 years now. Since Malice came out in 2012 or maybe 2013 it might have been, and I've really enjoyed everything that I've read of John Gwynne's work so far. So I really enjoyed Malice and I gave it 4 stars, and it was actually the first title that I used my weighted rating scale on, giving it 81%, which is a really good score for the opening book in a new series. The rest of the books in the Faithful and the Fallen, and indeed the Of Blood and Bone trilogy, all scored 90% plus, and it was 5 stars across the board for those. When it came to The Shadow of the Gods last year, book 1 of the Bloodsworn Saga, this was another book that I scored at 4 stars, and it came out just below Malice at 79% on my weighted rating. So it's a very similar opening kind of picture to what we got with The Faithful and the Fallen. So I think those two books, Malice and The Shadow of the Gods, and the scores that I gave them really typifies the way that I look at opening books in the series. A lot of people talk about the second book syndrome or middle book syndrome if you're talking about the traditional fantasy trilogy, and that's not generally something that I tend to subscribe to. For me, my enjoyment does tend to grow as I get further into a series. So the way I look at it, with the opening book in the series, you've got all of the setup to do. You've got to introduce the characters, you've got to introduce the storyline, and with fantasy you've got the additional complication of introducing the world itself and doing the actual world building. And for me, I typically find that my enjoyment increases the more I get to know about the world, the more natural it seems to me, which is why I tend to find that I'll generally score the opening book in a series a little bit lower, and then follow-up books in the series I will keep building on that score. Sometimes it may go down from a previous book, but generally speaking I tend to find that the first book in a series is the one that scores the lowest, at least on my weighted rating scale. So with all that in mind, with the way that I look at a series overall and with my experience of John Gwynne and his work, I was expecting to have a really good time with The Hunger of the Gods as book 2 of the Bloodsworn Saga. So with my John Gwynne history and my expectations out of the way, what did I actually think about the book itself? Well, I guess to start with, I'm told there's a bit of a pattern with regards to the opinion on The Hunger of the Gods, and you'll always have these people who just outright don't like it, so excluding those from the equation, I'm told that the only people who think that The Hunger of the Gods is better than Shadow of the Gods are those who already gave Shadow of the Gods 5 stars and have mentally given the series as a whole 5 stars already, and so The Hunger of the Gods could not possibly score any less. That doesn't apply to me though, because I gave, as I said, Shadow of the Gods 4 stars, but I did think that The Hunger of the Gods was an improvement on Shadow of the Gods, and that's partly at least down to the way that I view series and the way that my enjoyment of the series does generally tend to improve with each subsequent book. I will say in advance that I gave Hunger of the Gods 4 stars as well, so the two books match in that respect. For me it's a good book, but it's not a great book. It does have its flaws, but generally speaking there are more than enough positives to outweigh those. It is a book that I wanted to be better than I found it to be, but I realise it's probably for me never going to reach the heights of The Faithful and Fallen, and it would be impossible to really judge them, compare them to each other, because they are two vastly different series, two vastly different settings. Looking at some of the individual elements of this book then, and as I expected from my experience with John Gwynne, we start off exactly where we left our characters and left our storyline at the end of The Shadow of the Gods. This is a technique that John Gwynne uses that I really appreciate. There's no passing of time in between book 1, book 2, book 3, and that means that if you have the opportunity to, whether you're coming to the series late or you're rereading at a later date, you can read the series back to back as one big story rather than as individual books. I was slightly concerned, I guess, because in The Shadow of the Gods we follow our three point of view characters, and I could definitely see where their storylines would be converging, and there was the opportunity for those three characters to all kind of follow the same path in The Hunger of the Gods and beyond. But that concern was quickly addressed towards the start of The Hunger of the Gods, and just as far as spoilers go, because I do give spoiler-free reviews, that's as much of a spoiler for the storyline of The Hunger of the Gods as I believe I'll be giving. Overall, I do like the storyline that we have here, although I felt that, especially in this book, there were a few too many coincidences, whether that's a case of individual groups of people independently doing exactly the same thing within a short space of time of another group, or if it was characters and their storylines becoming intertwined despite the odds of that actually happening, even in a work of fiction. One of the things that I really do appreciate about the plot is that it's a book or even a series with some absolutely massive stakes, and what it all boils down to though is a couple of characters who are just trying to get their children back. And that's kind of refreshing, but also maybe kind of strange, because you have all of this happening and it's not even as if it's in the background, it is pretty much front and center, but actually that's not the focal point of the main story itself. Now the characters really drive this, of course, and our three returning point of view characters from The Shadow of the Gods are all characters that I do particularly like. In The Shadow of the Gods, I felt that Varg was maybe a little bit inferior to Elvar and Orca. I didn't like his storyline and his development quite as much as I did for the other two, but here there is a definite improvement, and I actually really appreciated his story and the things that he goes through and the way that he grows as a character and as a warrior. I also really liked the development of Elvar's character here and the storyline that she has, and I think for me she was probably my favourite character in The Shadow of the Gods, and she's probably just about still my favourite for the series overall. And of course everybody talks about Orca and how great a character she is, and she is a refreshing character and she is a really great character, but I don't think I'd quite put her on as high a pedestal as everyone else seems to. In The Shadow of the Gods, one of the little complaints that I did have was it was a little bit difficult at times to keep a track of everyone, in particular with regards to the two warbands. So you've got the Bloodsworn and you've got the Battlegrim as the two main warbands, at least. You see plenty of others, but they're the two main warbands that we do spend a lot of time with and that we know specific characters from. And I found at times that when we were talking about some of the side characters, some of the kind of less important, if you like, characters who are not as close to Varg and Elvar, for instance, so we don't see them as much, I found it difficult to remember which of those characters came from which warband, and it was just a little bit much for me at times trying to tie everyone down and see where they were going. But I didn't feel that here in The Hunger of the Gods at all. With this book I had a really good time actually with both of the warbands, and I found that they were both settled for me in terms of the character development as a warband as opposed to the individual characters within them, because we did see a lot more of them. And by settled, I'm really talking about the way that I perceive them and how comfortable I am with them and who is in which warband, as opposed to how they are as the actual warbands themselves, because of course by the end of Shadow of the Gods at least, they've both pretty much been through hell. Now I've said a few times in the past that in terms of Joe Abercrombie's books in the First Law World, the parts that I really liked the most were any of those involving the Northmen, because I loved the way that they interact with each other and I love the natural banter that they have. And that's exactly what I got here from both the Bloodsworn and the Battlegrim. I had a really good time whenever we were just experiencing almost the day-to-day, not just in terms of battle or training or rowing, but everything in between. When they're around the fireside, when they're just generally talking, it just felt so natural and there was good banter between them, and I really enjoyed those moments. The world building in the Bloodsworn Saga continues of course to be one of the main draws of the series, and here we get more expansion, we get more history, we get more creatures appearing, and some of them quite frankly would be right at home in a horror story, because there are some really disturbing times that some of these characters end up going through here. For me overall there is a little bit too much terminology still. Normally when I have a series like this, That's one of the things that takes me a little while to get used to in book one, and then by book two I'm generally a bit more at home with it. I've got my head around what everything is, and it all almost seems natural to me. I experienced that with the Tie Child trilogy by R.J. Barker, where in book one we pretty much had all of this new terminology of this strange new world thrown at us, and it was just a little bit too much. And then in book two, it all just sounded right. I knew what everything was. Here it was mostly the same, and I knew what everything was, and I was comfortable with my understanding of what was being spoken about at any one time. But the thing that didn't quite work for me was just the amount of italics used in this book to represent the Norse-inspired language of the world. So any of the creatures, the ranks of people, the arms and armour and things like that, but also the magic that's used in this world and when spells are actually cast, all of that is in italics, and it's a little bit strange. It kind of takes me out of the flow of reading it because I look at a page and just from a glance I can see the difference in the writing with all of these italics there. And I don't know what it is, it's just something about the way that I read, but that just really kind of throws me off a little bit. Now, there was also another little thing with regards to the writing style itself that threw me off, and it was something that was generally focused around the battle scenes. So I've said previously that I really enjoy John Gwynne's battle scenes, and for me he is probably one of the best in the business at the moment. But here I found that there were various instances where we would have these kind of little half sentences that just didn't quite work for me and the way that I like to read. And I'm told this is all about psychic proximity or psychic distance, but it just doesn't quite work for me. There's different ways of doing that, and again it was something that I found just a little bit jarring in this particular book and just took me out of the moment, took me out of my enjoyment as I was going back and reading a sentence again to see if I had misread it, and it turns out it was just the way that the sentence was written. So that's one thing that really didn't work for me, and that impacted my enjoyment of this, especially in those really intense battle scenes that were otherwise, as usual, really, really good. So overall, those few niggles aside, this was a really good book. It wasn't a great book for me. It's not one that's going to reach the heights of The Faithful and Fallen for me. But as I said towards the top of the video, a large portion of that is probably my own personal preferences and where I'm a little bit more at home in the type of setting that we have in the Banished Lands to what we have in the Bloodsworn Saga. Saying that though, the overall story itself is really, really excellent, and I will definitely be anticipating book 3 in this series coming out with just as much enthusiasm as I had for book 1 and for book 2. So as I said, this is a 4-star book for me because I did generally really enjoy it. Let's get into my weighted ratings though and break that down a little bit. So starting off as usual with the enjoyment factor, and with this one I've given it 16 out of 20 because some of those little elements that I mentioned there, some of those little niggles just took me out of the kind of flow of reading it a little bit too much, and it did mean that I enjoyed it less than I might otherwise have done. For the world building I gave 19 because I really do like this world, even despite what I've said about the different types of settings that I'm a bit more comfortable with. The actual world building itself that's gone into this book and this series is really top notch. I love all of the dead gods and the way that they've really lent themselves to the magic of this world with the power that's left in their bones and artifacts that were around in their time, but also in their blood that's been passed down through the generations to what we now refer to as the Tainted. I think the whole concept is really, really excellent and it's all done very, very well. For the characters, I've given 18 out of 20 because I really did like both the main characters that we have here with our 3 point of view characters from Shadow of Gods and all of those extra characters, the side characters, mostly through the Battle Grim and the Bloodsworn Warbands. We also do have 2 additional point of view characters here which I think really elevate this part of the book. So both of these are characters that we know from Shadow of the Gods. We have Bjorn and we have Guthar, and they both add an interesting element because we start to see a bit more of the opposing viewpoint. So all of our main characters from the first book, Elvar, Varg and Orca, are all essentially on the same side, and Bjorn and Guthar are essentially on the opposing side to that. So this is something that we saw in both the Faithful and the Fallen and of Blood and Bone, and now we're seeing it in the Bloodsworn Saga as well, and I definitely appreciated it. For the plot, I gave 17 out of 20. I said a few moments ago that I really like the overall story, but I also like those little intricacies where we've got these really massive world-changing events happening, but actually we've got characters who don't really care about that. All they care about is family, and it's a really nice refreshing change to have that. Normally when I do see something along those lines, it's more of a kind of self-contained story, and we don't have these kind of massive events that are happening around the character at the same time. So that's something that I really appreciate about this story, and it's nice to see though that they do still have an impact on each other, those two different elements of the story. For the writing style, I've given 6 out of 10. This is one of the areas that I mentioned in the main body of the review that I did feel a little bit let down with, mostly with regards to those action scenes and the way that language was used there with the kind of what I see as half sentences. And I'm talking about, for instance, I think there was a scene where someone was in the middle of a battle and they're essentially running away and there's someone following them, and the line that's used as a full sentence is footsteps echoing behind him. Whereas for me, what would fit better in that specific example would be footsteps echoed behind him. So it's little things like that, little subtle differences that just took me out of the moment just a little bit too much. The pacing here I thought was really good. I've given it 4 out of 5. I've heard a few people say that they felt the Hunger of the Gods started off too slow and it took a while to get moving. I didn't think that whatsoever. I thought it was really nicely paced throughout the entire book. And then for my discretionary section, I've also given it 4 out of 5. There's quite a few nice little extras that we get here. First of all, of course, we've got that really nice cover that everybody talks about. Inside the book itself, though, we also have a map, we've got a glossary, we've got a character list, we've got a little mini kind of pronunciation guide which tells us, I think they might be Icelandic characters, how to pronounce a couple of those, and it gives examples of a couple of words that use these symbols and how you would pronounce them as well. And then the other thing that we have, of course, is a recap of the previous story, so you can refresh yourself before getting into this one exactly where we were at the end of the Shadow of the Gods, and I know that a lot of people really do appreciate that. So the overall score for The Hunger of the Gods then is 84%, which is a really fantastic score. It puts it at equal 16th in my all-time Hall of Fame, so not too far away from the top 10. Despite the fact that I had a few little niggles with this book, the individual elements, especially the world building, really do help to elevate the overall score of the book. So there we go then, that's The Hunger of the Gods by John Gwynne, book 2 in the Bloodsworn Saga. I'm really looking forward to book 3 in this series. I'm not sure when that's going to be or what it's going to be called, and chances are there will be a delay with this one, but I will definitely be looking to get a copy on the shelf to complete the set when that one does come out. Let me know in the comments down below, as always, if you've read this or if you're looking forward to it. What are your thoughts about it? What are your expectations? As always, in the description box below the video you can find all my social media and support the channel links. I'll hopefully see you in the next video, but until then, as always, take care of yourselves, read some good books. Bye for now.